Hey everybody, welcome back. I want to thank everybody for watching my Poochie video. That did much better than I thought it would, and it's slowly been doing better, so I thought I would finally make that DIO video that people have been asking me to make. I wanted to wait until I had some better equipment, but I'm sure this will do just fine. I am in front of a different bookcase. I don't have all my manga here, but I threw what I do have up here, and I've got DIO behind me as well, so let's just get into this. It might end up being a long video. I don't know. I've just wrote up a list of what I want to talk about, and so we'll get right into that. So I want to quick do an overview of DIO, his life, and what he did and all that. Most of you are already going to know all of what's going on there, so you can probably skip some of that if you want to. But for people who don't know as much about JoJo's, and don't care about spoilers, I'll just jump into a quick overview. I won't talk about too much, but a quick overview of DIO. So he was originally this kind of like English peasant, I guess. He lived in really, really poor conditions. He had a single father who was abusive and alcoholic. He very poor, and I suppose you could say just about one of the unluckiest positions you could be in life as just a young child. Fortunately, he has this kind of stroke of luck where he gets adopted by the Joestar family after poisoning and killing his own dad. Well, maybe he couldn't call it luck, but anyway, he gets adopted by the Joestar family, which is a rich family, this wealthy family that takes him in, and George Joestar considers DIO to be his son. So DIO clearly has nefarious ideas and plans as soon as he arrives. He's planning to kill the man who just adopted him and take all his money. The only one standing in his way is the only person who sees his plan, and that would be Jonathan Joestar, his adoptive brother. And Jonathan is intent on stopping him from taking this plan too far, but doesn't really fully succeed. He doesn't manage to save his father. George Joestar dies, but DIO, to be fair, doesn't get the money. He doesn't even get the house. It's burned down. And so I guess you could say Jonathan kind of stopped the plan, but not well enough. DIO escapes, and not only that, but he manages to get vampiric powers along the way. So things get a little crazy after that. Yeah, Jonathan Joestar gets more powerful. He gets taught by Willem Zappelli, so he can hunt down DIO. And he finally defeats DIO and thinks he's killed him. But DIO's actually survived, except he's just a disembodied head, which then hunts down Jonathan Joestar and kills him and steals his body. So then DIO can continue living for decades with his head on top of Jonathan's body. If you've never watched JoJo, that sounds crazy. Later on, we find DIO having this interaction with Poochie, which I talked about a little bit in my last video. And it's this seemingly out of character interaction where he's kind to Poochie and is usually when DIO's around other humans he's killing them, but with Poochie he's just laying on a couch and talking about his dreams, and he has this major influence on Poochie. And then he continues on to kind of travel the world. He fathers a bunch of children along the way and then ditches them, and then he finds himself in Cairo, Egypt, at the end of Stardust Crusaders, when Jonathan's great-great-grandson, I think it is, finally meets up with him and kills him for good this time. Even burns him up in the sun so that there's nothing even but ashes left. So immediately, a lot of questions come up. The first one I think a lot of people ask when thinking about DIO is this weird... is why is he so kind to Poochie? It does seem very out of character for him, and people really wonder why he would do that. And I think it boils down to a kind of mischaracterization of DIO's personality. I see a lot of people just label him as something of like a psychopath, this megalomaniac who doesn't have feelings and doesn't care about anything and just wants to be in a position of power, so to speak. But I don't necessarily see DIO that way. I see him as more of like a sociopath, and even then, maybe not fully. I think deep in DIO's heart, there is still human left in there. And I want to talk about why I think that is. And partially, I think we see that in his relationship with Poochie, where he thinks he's found some kind of kindred spirit, someone else who's had a rough upbringing, and he wants to, and Dio, like all humans, he is originally human. He's a vampire by this point, but for the most part he is a human, at least mentally speaking, I suppose, psychologically. And like all humans, he desires to be known by others, and he desires to have relationships in his life. Even I think psychopaths would desire to have people know things about them and not just be complete strangers. From the future here, if I might interrupt myself, I'd like to talk a little bit more about Poochie and Dio being friends, because certainly Dio doesn't ever have that relationship with anyone else. I heard someone point out that Dio didn't even have this kind of relationship with Vanilla Ice, and Vanilla Ice seemed to be a worshiper of Dio. So why then does Dio have this special relationship with Poochie? What's so special about Poochie? Well, I think it ties a little bit in with how Dio views Jonathan. Dio is obsessed with Jonathan. And part of that, I think, has to be because Dio sees a little bit of himself in Poochie and in Jonathan. I think I mentioned that a little bit earlier. Because Dio views himself as this victim who's gone through such hardships, and he sees Poochie as someone who has also gone through tragedy, who can understand what he's going through. On some level, of course, not fully. He is an immortal vampire, difficult to understand. Jonathan also, that's why Dio had such respect for Jonathan by the end of part 1, is because he saw Jonathan as such like this mythical character who can go through terrible tragedy like Dio, but come out of it a better person. I'm sure that made Dio very upset, but also very intrigued at the same time. On one hand, Dio reacts towards great people the same way that terrible people tend to react to good people in the real world. Megalomaniacs who just want power are always going to feel threatened by people who are happy, who are joyful, who do good things, because doing those things gives them power that the megalomaniac can never get. Helping others and feeling joy is something that the megalomaniac can't have, and as someone who desires power, who desires to have everything, that pisses them off. So it's especially irritating when someone like Dio sees someone like Jonathan go through tragedy, and instead of becoming like Dio, he becomes a hero. And Jonathan, if you know much about Araki's writing, Jonathan is written to be this perfect, good person, despite the tragedy he went through. I'm sure Dio would not have been able to wrap his mind around that. He wouldn't have been able to understand that. To him, tragedy makes you a bad person. How could you be like Jonathan after going through what Jonathan went through? Poochie, on the other hand, makes so much more sense to Dio. He went through tragedy and slowly is becoming a worse person because of it, because of his response. I talked before in my last video that Poochie's response to misfortune was not to go to God and deal it out with him, but instead slowly lose his mind and become maniacal and evil. In a sense, part of their friendship was like being at a zoo. You like to look at the animals, you think they're really interesting, you might even feed them and act nicely to them, but they're really just there for you to look at and get some entertainment out of along the way. But Dio also allows Poochie to be his successor, which is a big deal. That's not nothing. But I sometimes wonder if that was ever purposeful, if Dio ever actually expected Poochie to be a successor. I mean, Dio was functionally immortal, and I'm sure in his egotistical brain never actually contemplated the thought that he could die. I mean, realistically, he probably envisioned himself never being able to be defeated, never losing, and thus the idea of a successor would be pretty much moot. So I think, to some degree, the idea of Dio giving Poochie the title of his successor was more for show than for actual purpose.
It's like a vice president in the United States, I guess. So in a sense, Dio's friendship with Poochie is not entirely one-sided, but definitely we see different levels of intimacy between the two characters. To Poochie, this is a serious friendship. Dio is actually his friend, actually someone that he can share with, whereas for Dio, Poochie's more like his pet. But because Dio was such a captivating person, Poochie's never really led on to that. Although Poochie is not a mindless minion follower either. He has his own thoughts, and that's why Dio has such a fun time arguing philosophy with him. But I also think Dio is doing that out of a need for playfulness. Not as so much that he needs to debate, but it's fun. He never gets to do that, so why not do that? So I don't want to say that people are pulling too much out of this friendship. I don't think that's true, but it doesn't characterize Dio as a good enough person as people think it does, if that makes sense. Although I think to some degree it does humanize him somewhat. Dio wants to be known by others and have friends, as we all do, because he was a human and still psychologically is a human. And humans want to have friends. They want to have people in their lives. Even the completely crazy ones still desire to have friends. And even Dio, with all that was wrong with him, all his psychological issues, all his manipulative tendencies and megalomania, he still, in his deepest of heart, wanted a friend. Back to the past.
Before I go any deeper on that, I do want to point out one of the most striking parts of Dio's character that people point out a lot in relation to Christianity, and that would be his name. His name is God in Italian, and his son Giorno is characterized as a Jesus kind of character because he's Dio's son, and he fights Diavolo, who's obviously his name is based off of the devil. I'm not going to get too much into that right now. And I've shared a little bit before about how I don't think that goes too deep. I think it's more of like a surface level kind of thing. It's just he's named Dio, and then when writing part 5, Araki was like, "Oh shoot, Dio's son. That's God's son. That's Jesus." So I don't think that's meant to be super deep. But I do, as I was writing this video, I do think Dio's name is actually a very good name for him. Not because he's supposed to be a characterization of God, but because he's the perfect characterization for someone who wants to be God, a man who wishes he was God. Such a man would probably call himself God or Dio. So why do I say this? We see in Dio a lot of different ways that he tries to take on the characteristics of God. Firstly, his heaven plan, which I'm definitely going to talk about in more detail later. But his heaven plan is about controlling people. It's about controlling the future, controlling fate. Secondly is his stand in the world, which lets him stop time. For a few moments, he can be apart from time. Thirdly, his manipulative personality, in which he wants to control people around him and make them do what he wants them to do all the time, and make sure that no one's ever against him. And 4, just the idea of anyone else being as powerful as him or on the same wavelength as him is just nonsense. It's abhorrent. It couldn't be possible. He sees himself as being higher than everybody else, and he wants to be higher than everybody else. As we see in part 6 even, if his heaven plan were to work, he essentially would be a god, and with all the power that he would have and control over everything. But why does he want to be God? Why would he desire to take on the characteristics of God? And of course, that's a difficult question to answer. You could ask that about anybody. There are real people in real life who would like to be God, and they don't see any problem with that. But I'd like to just throw out a few reasons why you don't want to be God. Firstly, the most responsibility ever you could possibly have would come along with that role, and I don't think anyone could actually live up to that except for God. Second, unless you are always God, then you would have a very difficult time taking in all of the information that you don't already have. God has always been God, so he's always had the information. He's always had all of the information. If you wanted to be God, you would have to somehow obtain all information, and that process would not only be impossible, but would probably take an incredibly long time and be incredibly difficult, even if it were possible. And ultimately, you could say that about any attribute of God, that we could not attain it, and even if we could obtain it, it would take so long, it would be so arduous.
And the number one reason you don't want to be God is because logically you can't be. In order to be God, you would have had to always be God. It's a completely fruitless effort and not even one worth taking to begin with. So if you're thinking about trying to be God anytime soon, maybe pick up a hobby or something. It won't last as long.
But Dio doesn't really see that. He only sees kind of the upsides of being God, so to speak. He doesn't see all of the knowledge that you need to have, all of the goodness and love that you need to be fully embodied by. He just sees it as being in complete control, having all the power. And who wouldn't want that? And of course, Dio wants power. That's normal for children who grow up in terrible conditions like that. If you've taken any kind of psychology course or learned about child psychology, I guess specifically, you'd know that when a child feels like they're out of control, what they're going to do is they're going to act out and do bad things because that makes them feel like they're in control. That's basically what Dio was doing. He felt like he was not in control when he was a child. His father was abusive. His mother, I believe, was dead before the story even started. And he was living in such poor conditions. There's nothing that he could do. He felt so out of control. There was nothing that he was in control of. So of course he would desire to be in control of everything, the complete opposite of what his state actually was. And step by step through the story, he gains more and more power and control over things, whether it be manipulating other people and getting control over them, or it's control over time, or hopefully in the future, control over the entire universe and people's fate and their knowledge and your knowledge. He would gain control over everything, and that's what he wanted. And so that brings us to the heaven plan, which I didn't talk about really much at all in detail in my last video, so I'll do that now. The heaven plan, summed up as best I can, is, because it's very complicated, is that in Dio's mind, the perfect heaven on earth would be if everybody knew their own futures, knew their own fate. And that's it. And he tried to attain that. He tried to work towards finding out a way, gaining a stand power that would reset the universe, changed so that everybody knew the future. I feel like a lot of people don't talk about why that would not be a good thing. Part 6, if my memory serves me, doesn't even talk really about if that's a good or a bad thing. Poochie explains it, and then the story moves on. There's never a moment where Jolene has a protagonist monologue about why Poochie's wrong. She doesn't even do the classic shonen protagonist, you're wrong because I have friends thing. So I want to talk about why, from a realistic perspective, why the heaven plan is bad. Because I'm sure a lot of people read part 6 and think, yeah, I would like to know my future. I think that would be pretty cool if I knew my fate. I would like that. You've probably heard before why it would be a bad thing for us to know our own future. Why there's a reason why God made the universe in the way that it is so that we do not know the future, so that we don't know what's going to happen, and he doesn't tell us. Because there is a reason. There is a reason why God does not tell us what the future is and why we don't know. We're made to not know what the future is, what our fate is, if we have a fate. Some people would disagree. That doesn't really matter for the purposes of this video.
Back again from the future, I want to interject again about this heaven plan thing. So I spoke a whole bunch about why we aren't supposed to know our future, but I cut that all out because it's too deep to get into for this video, and I didn't even explain it that well anyway. I just want to go on kind of a surface level here. The reason why we're made to not know our future, why God makes us as beings with limited mental capacity and can only live in the present as we are. The reason why that is has a lot of similarities to the issues with the heaven plan. The heaven plan has a lot of issues. I talk about some of them. One of the biggest issues is that it's just full of paradoxes that logically I can't figure out how to accurately explain. First of all, if I know my future, I know what I'm going to do. Can I just not do that? If not, then that means I'm just being controlled. I have no free will. I'm just a puppet. I literally cannot act outside my fate. But if I can change it, well, then I don't really know the future at all. If my knowledge of the future is constantly changing as I change the way that I do things, then that's not any different than our knowledge right now. Not very much anyway. And if we don't have any free will and no control over any of our actions in any meaningful way, then we're just robotic slaves. We're slaves to our own fate and robots incapable of being able to make any decisions. We just have to keep going along with the fate that's been prescribed to us since before we were born. At this point, I should start making it clear to you that this isn't the path to happiness. Being a robotic slave with no free will is probably not going to make you very happy. In fact, I'm not really sure what role emotions would play, if you would even feel them. If you did feel emotions, and wouldn't you just be fated to have felt those emotions anyway? Like I said, the heaven plan just has too many paradoxes that just don't make any sense. The issue with it, though, that bugs me the most is how if we're just these robotic slaves going along with our fate, and we know everything from the moment that we can know anything, we know our whole future, everything that's going to happen. We have all the knowledge of our own lives that we could possibly have all at once. There's no possible way that we could ever gain anything like wisdom. In DIO's heaven plan, wisdom does not exist. Nobody can have it. Wisdom is specifically gained through our life experiences. It cannot exist if we have all of our life experiences at once. You cannot grow wise in a universe following DIO's heaven plan. And that's obviously an issue. God obviously wants us to grow in our wisdom. That's all over the Bible. He's always asking us to grow in our wisdom and to come to him when we want to grow in that wisdom, when we have questions for him. He puts things in our lives so that we can grow in our wisdom. That's so vitally important to the human experience, to our lives, to who we are. And that cannot be possible in the heaven plan.
But see, DIO doesn't care about your life experiences. He doesn't care about your wisdom. He doesn't care about your life at all. He just wants to have power. And he wants to know his future. He wants not only himself, but everyone, Poochie included, they want to be free from guilt. If they know the future, they know what they're going to do, and they have no way of stopping it, then you can't say it's their fault. If they were born knowing that they were going to murder someone someday, then you can't really say it's their fault. They couldn't have chosen anything else. That's all that they care about. They want to be free from guilt while having all the power in the world, which doesn't actually make all that much sense when you think about it. Having more power but less guilt, less responsibility. Someone needs to watch a Spider-Man movie.
To DIO, heaven is happiness here on earth. And I'm sure you know someone in your life who sees heaven in the exact same way. I used to know somebody who said that heaven wasn't like a real place, but it was more like a state of mind. And I think a lot of people, especially nowadays, tend to view heaven in that way. It's not a physically real place that you can be. It's just whether or not you're happy. It's about here on earth. And that's something that DIO shares in common with a lot of people, even a lot of Christians today, is that heaven and God's ultimate goal, that it's all earth-centered. It's all about what's happening on earth. And they don't think about the eternal future. They don't even think about God at all. It's all about them. To DIO, and a lot of people in real life, they never think about God or anything about what the Bible actually says. They're all concerned with themselves and what's going on in their lives right now and on earth and how they can maximize their happiness. You may have heard that some people think that the innate human desire is to just maximize our pleasure, maximize our happiness, and that's not a bad thing, that's a good thing. It's this kind of evolutionary hedonism kind of thought. And Dio shows that really well, I think. He's quite hedonistic, at least for a while. Eventually, once he's gotten a fill of everything and it didn't satisfy him, he kind of moves on and he passes a lot of those lessons on to Poochie about not being too involved in hedonistic practices because they're just going to distract you. But certainly for a while, Dio was quite hedonistic, especially while he was running around fathering kids everywhere. And I think this theology about Earth being the heaven, or that our state of mind, our happiness is heaven, is just a deeply rooted hedonistic kind of view. Because ultimately then, it's about our happiness. It's about us being happy all the time. It's not even about other people. It's not about God and His plan. It's not about heaven being a place that we can be at in the future. It's about, am I happy right now, and how, and if I'm not, how can I be? Of course, Dio's plan seemed like he wanted everyone on the planet to be happy by knowing their own fate, but it was really just about him. He just wanted to be happy by knowing his own fate, but it wasn't meant to be. If you think heaven is about happiness here and now, or it's just a state of mind, I want to remind you that heaven is so much more than an emotion. It's so much more than a feeling or a state of mind. Heaven is a real place where God's people will be able to live forever and will experience joy while we're there. Joy being very different than happiness. Happiness, as hedonists will find, is fleeting. Joy, however, is not. Happiness will come and go all the time. We have no control over that. Joy, on the other hand, as long as we're willing to hold on to it, it will never leave us. I can talk more about the difference between joy and happiness in the future. You can look up a YouTube video about that now if you really want to. But I think it's really easy to see where Dio went wrong, as he spent all this time chasing happiness that was going to be fleeting anyway, when he could have just had joy at the time and rested with that. Back to the past.
In a world where everybody knows their fate and everyone's just robotic, then good and evil would cease to exist as well. Again, if I'm not making any choices and you're not making any choices, I'm just doing what I'm fated to do and you're just doing what you're fated to do, then you can't really call any of my actions evil or good. I'm just doing them because that's what I'm supposed to do. I'm doing that because I was just born into a life that has predisposed me to be doing that. And at this point, I'd like to just point out that some strains of Christianity posit that we do have fated lives. We are predestined to make choices and God is kind of in control of every choice that we make and is making us do different things. And some of them would posit that, and other people would posit that you would have these same issues. But I would point out that God being in control of everything is a whole lot different than Dio being in control of everything. There's a much bigger moral quandary with a vampire having control of your actions than an all-loving, all-good God. And I'm not saying that I fully agree with that strain anyway. Again, not the point of the video, just pointing out that it wouldn't contradict my argument.
My point being is that if Dio was in control of everything, he definitely doesn't have your best interests in mind. When God's putting things into your life, He's doing that to make you a better person, ultimately. If Dio's putting things into your life, it's not for your betterment. He doesn't care if you're becoming a better person through the trials of your life. He's throwing roadblocks and hurdles and trials into your life just to stumble you. He doesn't care about your betterment. He doesn't care about your reactions to things and how that shapes you. That doesn't matter to him. If anything, he's putting trials in your life to make himself a stronger person.
I always say that it's not the things that happen to us that shape us, but our responses to the things that happen to us that shape us. To see what I mean, let's look at Jonathan Joestar and Dio Brando. When Jonathan had terrible things happen to him, when his dad was killed, his adopted brother turns into a supervillain and a vampire and burns his house down, his response is, how can I help save people? How can I get more powerful to stop Dio from hurting people? his response was a good response. But Dio, when he had terrible things happen to him, when he lived in poverty with an abusive father, his response was a bad response. It was, how can I hurt people? How can I take my anger out on others? His response was to lose feeling. Whereas Jonathan's response was to embrace that feeling and let it lead him to do good things. Dio had a chance, I think, to turn on the right path. I don't think he was destined for evil. At one point, Dio's looking at the grave of his father, and he says that he doesn't want to ever be like his father. And while a very sad notion, I think it's one he could have used to become a better person, to become like a good father to his kids. But instead, he becomes pretty much exactly like his father. He has kids and abandons them. He's certainly not a good father to them. They never even knew him. But then the question becomes, why do we respond to things the way we do? Why can't we all just respond well to things? Why can't we all have good responses to the things that happen to us? Well, our choices are based somewhat on our past choices, our responses based on our past responses, and our first responses are based somewhat off of the idol in our life who is doing the responding. So for most of us, that's our parents. We see how they respond to things, so when we start to be old enough to respond to things ourselves, we're going to mimic how they did it. For Jonathan Joestar, he had a great dad who was a good person, who did good things and responded well to things. For Dio, that was an alcoholic and abusive father who didn't respond well to anything that happened to him. In fact, Dio's father, his response to when things happened to him was to take advantage of people. And Dio mimicked that. He didn't want to be like his father, but he's exactly like his father.
I also want to interject that if you find yourself in a place like Dio where you're just making so many poor choices, you're making your responses to things are always terrible, you don't really know how to fix that because you're modeled off of the first influences you've had in your life, and your choices are built on your past choices, which were bad, and it's just spiraling and getting worse and worse. It's important to realize that Jesus is literally the perfect idol for us to mimic our responses to the things that happen to us. If we want to know how to respond better to things, on how to respond perfectly well to situations, we need to look to Jesus. And when Jesus becomes the person that we're taking all our inspiration from on how to respond to things, we will quickly become better people. It won't happen instantaneously, but depending on how well you follow Jesus, you should notice change pretty quickly, I think. In the New Testament, we don't see Jesus responding literally to everything that could ever happen, ever, obviously, but we get the necessary responses that we need to see to be able to work in our own lives to make our responses better. Any other idol is going to fail you to some degree. You can look at people like Jonathan Joestar to mimic your responses off of, or a person in your life that you think is really wise and good at doing things. You can look to other humans, but ultimately we need to be looking at Jesus because he's God. He's the one who knows how to perfectly respond to things, and we need to mimic what he's doing. Because if we don't, we could end up like him.
And ultimately, that's why Dio becomes who he is. Because he made a series of poor choices when bad things happen to him. Instead of choosing to let those bad things that happen to him, to let those tragedies shape him into a better person, he chooses to let them make him a worse person. The things that happen to us are going to shape us. The only question is, how are they going to shape us? It's up to us to decide how they're going to shape us. God wants us to become better people, and that's why he puts roadblocks in our path so that we can become better at jumping. But if we fail, that's still on us. If we fail to jump over a hurdle, or we just stop running the track altogether, we can't very well blame God. So I want to finish off this video by turning it over to you. What's happening in your life that you need to respond to? And how are you going to respond to it? Are you going to choose to respond well to it and become a better person? Or are you going to respond poorly? And I want to remind you that Jonathan didn't do it alone. He had a William Zappelli. He had friends. He had Arena. On the other hand, sat in a castle by himself surrounded by a bunch of brain-dead zombies. If you want to respond well to things that happen to you, don't be afraid to find your own William Zappelli. Don't be afraid to find your own Arena, or don't be afraid to surround yourself with friends. And if you're all by yourself, surrounded by a bunch of brain-dead people, that might be contributing to why you're responding poorly. And if it feels like you're out of control, and it feels like you don't have control over things in your life right now, remember that you weren't made to have control over everything. You weren't made to be God. You were made to be a human, and humans have limitations. They are not in control of some things. So instead of responding like Dio and trying to be God when you really don't want to anyway, maybe respond to God and talk to the person who is in control. In conclusion, I see Dio as this character who is shaped by tragedy into being this kind of sociopath who desperately wants to be God and attain the power and control of God so that he can be in control and not feel weak anymore. And that's certainly very interesting to me because there are real people in real life that can be described that way too, who feel weak, so they try to gain power and be in positions of power so that they can feel strong, so that they can have control over people. But that's always fleeting, that's always vapid, because human beings are not meant to have complete control. Any power in a human's hands is ultimately going to be meaningless. It's ultimately going to go away. Even Dio, an immortal vampire, I'll say it again, but even Dio, an immortal vampire with the ability to stop time, still died. Still lost his power. And to a high schooler, no less. Spend some time thinking about what you want and if it's even worth having. If Dio wanted, he could have grown up in the Joestar family, wealthy, with friends. To some impoverished people, that's the luckiest thing that could happen to someone. But Dio threw it all away because he wanted power. And he ultimately paid for it. Don't throw away the good things in your life because they're not what you want. Don't throw away the blessings in your life because they aren't the blessings you want. And if you're trying to be like God, my best advice is to stop and let God do that for you. I also just want to say before I end the video, I know I talked about some pretty deep philosophical, theological issues that deserve hours and hours of discussion, but I don't want to get too deep into the apologetics right now, partly because there are people who do that better than me, and you can look that up on YouTube, but also because I wanted to focus as much as I could on Dio and not go off on philosophical tangents. So I hope you'll forgive me if it felt like I was leaving out stuff or wasn't explaining things as well as I could have. When it comes to the Bible, I could talk for 12 hours and you'd still think I wasn't explaining things well enough. So I'd ask for a little bit of grace on that. Thanks again for watching. Write in the comments what you'd like to see me talk about next. If there's anything you thought I missed, I can definitely talk about it again. If there's an anime or an anime character you'd like me to talk about next, please let me know. Thank you again.